Here is the list when you take the top 50 from Daniel Jeremiah on NFL.com and you only look at wide receivers. This is how they stack up per the NFL Network and Daniel Jeremiah. At 13, the 13th best prospect, he has Jordan Addison. That's the first wide receiver on the list, the wide receiver from USC. At 19 on the list, he has Jaxon Smith Njigba, the wide receiver from Ohio State. 22 on the list is the next wide receiver, and that's Zay Flowers from Boston College. Quintin Johnston, who we've discussed at length here in the offseason as a wide receiver who could be available for the Bears, he comes in at number 30 on the list. So initially, what do you think of Daniel Jeremiah's rankings of the wide receivers? Addison, Smith Njigba, Flowers ahead of Johnston on the list from the NFL Network.
Well, I think you're going to get a quality wide receiver out of all of those guys, right? Like, I think out of any one that you pick, if you're the Bears, you're going to get a productive player from day one. Now, obviously, each one has a couple of knocks that he writes about, you know? He writes about Jordan Addison needing to be better on, in 50-50 balls. He writes that Zay Flowers is undersized. Like, there's a few knocks on each guy. And I always was under the impression that it was either Quintin Johnston or Jaxon Smith Njigba. Number one or number two, those guys are kind of interchangeable. I thought Zay Flowers was someone that the Bears could probably pick up. You know, we saw some mock drafts that go into the second round that have him late in the second round being available.
Right.
But I wouldn't be surprised if he's gone before the Bears pick in the second round. So to me, it's weird because you've got a lot of tight ends and stuff like that mixed in before, but there's not that much separation for me between the top four wide receivers because each of them have like an issue. There's not, the one guy like Marvin Harrison Jr., like Jamar Chase, like that you're going to get and be like, this is the guy you have to take as the first number one wide receiver.
The obvious stud.
Yeah. And because of that, I don't really have a problem with the rankings because I feel like he could have had them in another order. I would have been like, yeah, that sounds about right. And if you would have put Jaxon Smith Njigba as the number one wide receiver, all right, cool. Not a problem with that. If you would have put Zay Flowers, I've been like, all right, he's probably the fastest guy out there. That's what he likes about him. A little bit undersized, but super fast and has great hands. All right, I get that. For every negative, there's a few positives too for each of these guys. And I think that's why in this draft, you're going to see a run on wide receivers like we do in mostly every single draft. Someone takes one, and then other teams like, oh man, they took our guy. Now we got to get the next guy. And then the other team's like, now we got to get our guy. And you're not really going to have a bad choice with any of those guys, but it's very top heavy this year as far as wide receivers go. There's quality wide receivers after those 4 or 5 guys, but those 4 or 5 guys are like the studs of the first round, early second round. And after that, it kind of drops off a little bit.
Something that I was thinking about with this is that if you want to look at with these wide receivers and the available options, the one with the most production would be Zay Flowers from the group. 78 receptions, over 1,000 yards receiving last year, 12 touchdowns. So he would be the most productive of the ones that we're talking about. Obviously, Smith Njigba, he was injured last season. He only had 5 receptions. If you want to look at the stats from Smith Njigba, go to the year prior. That's when you really see the stats, 95 receptions, 9 touchdowns in 2021. When I look at the group overall, Johnston, what is interesting is at the start of the offseason, he was listed on most draft boards as the number one wide receiver. It seems as if after the combine, people have cooled on Quintin Johnston, that he's not necessarily the number one guy in most publications, whether it be ESPN, NFL.com, wherever you go to get your football coverage. It seems like the TCU wide receiver has kind of taken that second, third spot in most of these lists. I was surprised to see Zay Flowers at number 3, behind Addison and Smith Njigba. Now, Addison, the wide receiver from USC, his season was productive, but not as productive as his season was last year when he won the award for the best wide receiver in all of college football when he was at Pitt. In 2021, he had 100 receptions, 1,500 yards, 17 touchdowns. That was an incredible season. So, if you're only going off of stats that we've seen recently, Smith Njigba doesn't look as impressive, and Addison's numbers don't look as impressive as Flowers from last year. But if you go back one more season, Addison was the best wide receiver in all of college football. He was good last year for USC. He just wasn't as productive as he was the year prior for Pitt. So I think that's what's interesting. And then also there's a name that's not in this top 50 from Daniel Jeremiah at the wide receiver position. That's Jalen Hyatt. Jalen Hyatt was one of the biggest stories in the college football season for the first couple of months. You know, he and Hendon Hooker, the connection that they had at Tennessee. I mean, Hyatt last year had 15 touchdowns. He was really good. He was unstoppable. But I wonder if he is kind of the mold that Quintin Johnston is. And that's why maybe it's not as high on the draft board, even though he had the production last year.
I think it's because of the style of offense that Tennessee ran. You know, it's just kind of like go out there, run as fast as you can, try to get open. And then if it's like that avalanche style offense where if we get one, we're just going to keep piling on and we're going to keep throwing deep. And eventually our guys are tested and our guys are proven to have better stamina than your guys. So we're going to outrun you guys at some point. So we're going to keep pushing down the field. And, you know, his production went down when Hendon Hooker tore his ACL towards the end of the year. So it could be partly because of the system that they ran there at Tennessee.
You know, what's funny about that is if that system with Tennessee, we talked about it on the Chicago's College Tailgate show Saturdays in the fall that you and I hosted. We mentioned it because there were articles written about it and the high-flying offense from the Vols. The one thing that they do intentionally is they try and they line up their wide receivers as wide as possible on the football field to create as much possible separation as they can. So then they can run the football out of the passing formations. And like you said, it's an avalanche effect that we saw, you know, mainly it was like the Chip Kelly Oregon Ducks that kind of started it all, where the moment you get any positive momentum down the field, it kind of clicks everything into this hyper drive, this hyper speed of now we're only going to these simplistic plays and we're going to catch you off balance and take advantage of the numbers in the box. If you have too many bigs out there, we're going to throw. If you have smaller guys on the football field, we're going to run the football right up the gut. You're not going to be able to stop it. So I could see NFL teams looking at both Jalen Hyatt and Hendon Hooker and saying the offense is a bit gimmicky for Tennessee. They put up points in college.
It works, yeah.
But you can't necessarily do that in the NFL, thus discrediting those as they head into the draft. And that's why they're not at the same point as the quarterbacks and then also the wide receivers. Would you be okay if the Bears at 9 take Jordan Addison? Yeah, since he's the number one guy on Daniel Jeremiah's board?
I think so. I believe like I said, the negatives of him, of Jordan Addison and of Jaxon Smith Njigba and of Zay Flowers are less. Like Quintin Johnston, he writes about it. His biggest issue are his drops. He doesn't trust his hands. There's enough wide receivers on the Bears that were dropping footballs last year. Like I don't need that. You know, I need a guy that is going to win the 50-50 matchup, which is something he has a knock on against Jordan Addison. But that's something that can be. I think you can learn that. Like as long as you've got good hands and you can jump and make catches, I think you can sway that a little bit in your favor. I would take him over Zay Flowers just because of his size. I think that Mooney's supposed to be your speedster. He's supposed to be your fast guy. So you have that already. But if I'm got a wide receiver on my board, it's Jaxon Smith Njigba is my number 1. And maybe Jordan Addison's number 2. Quintin Johnston maybe number 3. And again, it's the size for me for Zay Flowers.
You know, what's funny is you mentioned too many wide receivers dropping passes for the Bears last season. Did you see the article in The Athletic from Mike Sando yesterday? The article is titled, "How did each NFL team free agent class and those moves stack up?" It was the column where he talked to executives around the NFL.
Yeah.
And he reached out to them for all 32 teams to get quotes on what they thought of what the teams did in free agency. And at the end of the part about the Chicago Bears, here's the quote from an executive in the league. Quote, "If I'm a Bears fan, I'm still really pissed that we lost the 32nd pick in this draft for Chase Claypool. How bad does that move look now that you had to include DJ Moore in the number 1 pick trade?" And that was from an executive in the NFL looking at this Bears team's offseason and what they accomplished. And the parting shot from the executive was, how mad should Bears fans be that they acquired Chase Claypool for the 32nd pick? Because that's Zay Flowers territory.
Yeah.
Right? Like in what we're discussing and where these wide receivers could fall in the first round. And I just think it's funny because you mentioned the drops. Chase Claypool basically did nothing in the amount of time that he was here last season. And I know it's tough to get into a new offense and find some kind of groove. And he did get hurt like the one game. It looked like Justin Fields was starting to go his way. But still, there was very little production. And you spent a lot to bring in Chase Claypool. And like the executive said to Mike Sando in The Athletic, the 32nd pick this year, that would be a damn good football player. So Chase Claypool is going to have to show out in this upcoming season.
I think there's still time for him. I'm not ready to say that it's a complete bust yet of a trade until I see what he does with a full off season, learning the playbook, and then also working and developing that chemistry with Justin Fields. He can learn the playbook all he wants, but Fields has to trust him. Remember, we talked about this with Justin Fields and Mooney when Allen Robinson was here. And Allen Robinson went MIA for the final season he was here because after practice and after training camp, wasn't getting reps with the ones. Darnell Mooney stayed after with him, and they developed that chemistry. So give Fields and Claypool a year together. And look, after next year, if it's a bad pick, I'll be the first one to say that it was a bad trade. Obviously a bad trade. Like you could have had this guy at 32. You could have had this guy at 32. Fine. But as of right now, like give it a year to see what it looks like. Give it an off season to see what it looks like. And let's see how they look together next season.